All right, can everybody hear me? Good?
Yeah.
All right. So welcome to the Lectern Series, and thanks for joining us this evening, both to those in the audience and those watching online. The Lectern Series began as a way to influence those in the community to give lectures about topics of interest and ultimately to be vessels of spreading knowledge and wisdom. Bernard Stiegler, a philosopher who I greatly admire, proposed that our era is one that is currently experiencing what he described as an absence of epoch. One such symptom is the inability to create potentions, or visualizing what's ahead, possibilities, rather than what's not. Close friends and family play an indispensable role in the realization of potential from both the perspective of the I and the we. The transmission of knowledge is crucial for a healthy epoch to develop, and this passing on of knowledge is what we hope to achieve at these events. To inspire thought rather than bringing about an absolute emptiness of it during the everydayness of our lives. Our interpretations and experience greatly affect how we ingest and express ideas. Therefore, the concept of an expert relies heavily on the empirical. I say this because I want anyone who is interested in giving a talk at the Lectern Series to feel empowered to do so without feeling inferior to how society defines those qualified for spreading knowledge. In the absence of an epoch, according to Stiegler, sharing rather than a controlled sharing of knowledge is indispensable. So without further ado, I want to introduce Holly Dodge, a teacher, a poet, a lover of all things nature. She will be giving a lecture on Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, giving grief roots, and our experience and how our experience can ultimately affect how we perceive meaning and purpose in our lives.
All right, so this is tradition that we're going to light the candle. It's really windy though, so if it goes out, it doesn't matter. We did it. Thank you for all coming to my garden tonight. I'm so pleased to see you all, and I'm very excited to get to share with you something I'm very passionate about. I remember the first time I read Walt Whitman. At 12, I was like many other preteens. I was a self-proclaimed intellectual. I always had my nose deep into Oedipus Rex, Beowulf, the Decameron of Boccaccio, Shakespeare, and others. Although I must add, I did lie about reading Moby Dick when I finally read it 2 years ago. I was 12 years old, and I knew in order to be a great intellectual, I had to attempt to read poetry. It's laughable to me now. I knew Walt Whitman was America's poet, so I thought, he can't be that bad. I had a beautiful green-bound copy of Leaves of Grass that I had bought at the Salvation Army with my mother. I opened the beautiful, musty-smelling book, and I began reading. I celebrate myself and sing of myself, and what I assume, you shall assume. Okay, this guy seems a little cocky, but I carried on. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. All right, now I'm annoyed. Who does this guy think he is, and why would anyone ever classify him as a master? His writing seemed pedantic and useless to me. I scoffed, folded the book shut, and placed it on my shelf for decades to come. In 2016, after a ridiculous streak of bad luck and life events, a dear friend of mine was in a critical motorcycle accident. My jovial friend, Jacques, was larger than life itself. I found myself having very dark moments of doubt and sadness and fear. What's the point of life if we always know death is coming? This sadly has been a theme in my life. My mother, Wendy, passed away unexpectedly in her sleep in 2018. She was only 56. My baby brother, Joel, passed away in 2011. He was only 19 years old, and he died of an accidental fentanyl overdose at home. He had just returned from an extended stay in Hawaii the week before. I was sitting outside in the days following my friend Chuck's death, staring at the grass on the lawn, thinking about a time in high school when a friend and I laid on our backs in the grass for hours, talking about the origins of life and comparing ourselves to the grass we often walk over with no regard. Believe it or not, we were stone sober. As I thought about that enlightening day, my mind wandered back to Mr. Whitman. I ran inside and I found my copy of Leaves of Grass, wondering if he had anything to say about this minuscule grass. He said, "What do you think has become of the young and old me? And what do you think has become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death." There it was. I suddenly had this insatiable desire to continue reading. I was feeling hopeful. As I read on, the cicada shrill voices whirled around me, the air felt electric, and the plants around me seemed to almost pulse. I know that may sound cheesy and heady, but this is truly how I felt in the moment. I looked around, convinced that the cherished people in my life that had died were all around me. The bugs, the worms, the grass, the swaying trees. My biggest fear of death suddenly had a pinprick of light. Years later, I would finally owe up to that self-proclaimed intellect I had claimed when I was 12, with the decision to earn my bachelor's degree in creative writing. Get this, with a focus in poetry. After finishing my bachelor's, I decided to pursue my master's degree, also in creative writing and also with a focus in poetry. It was in my second semester in a form and technique poetry course taught by the poet Richard Robbins that we did a deep dive on Walt Whitman, my favorite silver-haired poet. I spent countless hours studying the infamously long poem Song of Myself, even paging through and circling every single time he used the words I, me, or you. More on that soon. As a class, we spent a 3-hour class period reading every single word of Song of Myself out loud and in the round. It was beautiful and stirring, but we were all emotionally drained and soulfully refreshed at the conclusion. Spending so much time reading that expansive poem left me with a lot of questions and also some surprising discoveries, so I could not just end there. Whitman rewrote Leaves of Grass, the collection that houses Song of Myself, 9 times in his lifetime, even with the last edition occurring from his deathbed. For a poet whose work leans towards deism, it is obvious from his life actions that he viewed his soul as an immortal thing in a constant state of progress. Even Song of Myself changed over the last 3 decades of his life. But for today's discussion, I'm going to be primarily referencing his first printed edition of Song of Myself and Leaves of Grass, published in 1855. So first we need to talk briefly about Mr. Walt himself. He was born to a Quaker family in 1819 in Long Island, New York. He was the second of 9 children, and he was named after his father, Walter. Whitman, who was probably also a self-proclaimed intellectual, left formal schooling at the ripe age of 11. He worked as a printer's apprentice, called a printer's devil. He also worked as a journalist, a teacher, a government clerk, an editor, a freelance writer, and for a short time he even owned his own newspaper. His poetry was published anonymously by the New York Mirror when he was only 16, He also wrote a quirky guide under the pen name Mose Velser. Again, I'm going to repeat that, Mose, M-O-S-E, Velser. You might want to Google it later. And it was entitled Manly Health and Training. The self-help guide encourages men to grow long beards, sunbathe nude, bathe in cold water daily, and eat only meat at each and every meal. You'll Google it, I guarantee it. In 1850, Whitman decided he was tired of writing for others, and he decided he was bound to be a poet. He decided he wanted to write an American epic. As a poet, he experimented with many popular literary genres, but finally he settled on free verse with a bit of a biblical cadence. This stylistic decision to depart from the heavily metered and structured confines of more traditional and romantic poetry makes his work notable, and it began a long following legacy of free verse poems in all the years since. So in 1855, Walt self-published the very first edition of Leaves of Grass. He only printed 795 copies, and he did not include his name as author. Rather, 500 lines into his poem, he proclaims himself as author, which I must admit is quite admirable, because people had to read 500 lines in to give him a bad review. The public generally considered Leaves of Grass as irreputable, obscene, overtly sexual, and profane. And even one reviewer directly wrote him and called him a pretentious ass. Remember my earlier statement about him being cocky? I wasn't the only one. Public opinion was not fond of his collection, but a very famous writer who you may have heard of, Ralph Waldo Emerson, wrote Whitman a glowing review, starting his letter with, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career," which Walt immediately embossed in gold leaf applied to the spine of his second edition without Emerson's permission. Against the printer's trepidation, at public outcry, the second edition was released in 1856, then again in 1860, and 1867, and then on until 1891. Each collection had additional poems and many revisions of his original works. The longest poem in the collection, that I've already referred to as the sprawling Song of Myself, is what I want to talk about today. To a quick or an uneducated reader, it may seem discombobulated, fragmented, expansive, hell, even rambling. But the poem in particular has great scope, meaning, and order. And for me personally, it even has a bit of a divine message. You see, outside of his hard-earned and slowly acknowledged accomplishments within writing, Whitman was also struck by many personal tragedies. His father died just days after the first Leaves of Grass was published. He lost one brother at only 6 months old. He witnessed a civil war occurring, with his brother Georgie, who had just joined the Union, writing graphic letters to him, detailing everything he was seeing. His brother Andrew died of tuberculosis, and he had to admit his brother Jesse to an asylum. He lost his mother in 1873. On a search and rescue mission for his brother Georgie in the war, Walt witnessed firsthand the heart-wrenching injuries, amputations, and critical injuries that were sustained by soldiers. Whitman himself at 42 was hardly a candidate for a Union soldier. So he decided he would take it upon himself to thank and visit all the wounded soldiers in the hospitals. He comforted the wounded and the dying, bringing them small gifts, words, and jovial company. He became, in sense, a sensitive death doula, ensuring great men did not have to suffer or die alone. This concept is what really strikes me about Song of Myself. I do not think it is merely a democratic poem celebrating America or a fragmented observation of the common people. I don't even think it's a transcendental reflection on just nature itself, and I don't think it's a pretentious poetry hat trick, even though I did think that at 12. I think Song of Myself was a reckoning, a justification, a settlement with the fear and the ultimate demise of death. So let's talk about that a little further. In Song of Myself, there are a lot of defining characteristics of the poem. There's repetition and anaphora. Anaphora is like a repetitive word choice that shows up over and over, such as go big, go home. He often catalogs items, people, locations, situations. He does a lot of wordplay. He's noticed for his long lines. He uses a lot of metaphors, and a metaphor is a figure of speech in which you compare something to something that it is not or could not be. So, for instance, from Walt Whitman, the grass is a child. Well, the grass is not technically a child. You're comparing the grass to a child. He had strong line rhythm, even though his lines do not rhyme. He used a lot of imagery, used a lot of symbolism, and he used a lot of colloquialisms, which is common speech movements. More importantly, this poem is not just about Walt himself, like my 12-year-old sassy intellectual asked originally, but Walt invites us, the reader, on a reflection and a rumination. Although it is notable that in the 1855 edition of Song of Myself, Walt uses the word I 473 times, I counted it, the word me 187 times, the word myself 50 times, and the word you 158 times. An interesting side note, the 424th mention of I is also in a line that mentions 24 hours, and it reads, I see something of God each hour of the 24, and each moment then. I think he was a clever fox. You see, I don't believe Walt wrote this for himself. I believe that Walt considered the idea of self, as I mentioned before, as a journey, never static, a journey that is divine and even cosmic. So when Walt Whitman refers to himself or self, he's referring to all as a whole. Think of a blade of grass. A blade of grass is just like a snowflake. Every single blade of grass in this lawn right here is different from one another. But when we see blades of grass, we don't see a blade of grass. We see them as a whole. We see a lawn. They are all fulfilling the same purpose, regardless of differences in length, color, age, etc. So one is one of many, right? Look at it, it's all around us. Beautiful. That's why we're doing it here. Whitman is inviting us, the reader, to join him as a companion on his journey of self-discovery. Even in the famous opening lines, he uses intrapersonal, interpersonal, and transpersonal communication. Intrapersonal, line 1. I celebrate myself, I sing myself. Interpersonal, line 2. And what I assume, you shall assume. Transpersonal, line 3. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. Alright, so what does that mean? Let's start with interpersonal. Interpersonal is a reflection and introspection of one's own self or soul. It is the consciousness of the self or soul by connecting with the natural world. Connecting with the natural world relates to the regenerative traits of nature with reflection, connection, and also erotic imagery. I mean, think about the cycle of grass and the way that flowers bloom and pollination. Erotic imagery also suggests a metaphoric union with the body and the soul. Reflecting and accepting the natural world is an intrinsic and divine way to cope with your interpersonal communications. In lines 4 and 5, Walt jumps right in with more interpersonal communication. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spirit of summer breaths. So again, he's reflecting on nature as a form of divinity and self-discovery. So then when we talk about interpersonal is communication and connection with others. It's a sense of unity and fellowship with all those around you. It's symbiotic. You can't exist without the people around you or the forces around you. An interesting note about Song of Myself is that the poem's very first word is I, and the very last word is you. And by beginning with I and ending with you, it means we, together, combined. Another way that he focuses on interpersonal reflection is by cataloging diverse traits and human traits within Song of Myself. Also, the constant address of you acknowledges that he relies on you for his own transcendence. This reflection extends beyond intrapersonal, which is that self-realization, and it accepts and recognizes the souls and worths of all those around you. In line 390 of Song of Myself, he says, "What is man anyhow? What am I? And what are you?" So the transpersonal approach deals with ideas and concepts that extend beyond the personal psyche or beyond the material world. It is a physical and spiritual union. It is connected to the universe, everything around you, regardless of your physical state. And it is spiritual illumination. Within Song of Myself, I would also say that it is talking about how God is contained within. Towards the end of Song of Myself, he says, "I have said that the soul is no more than the body, and I have said that the body is not more than the soul, and nothing, not God, is greater to one than oneself is." So right there, Whitman has accepted the notion that God is within and that we can extend that power into the universe. It's also notable to mention that the progression of this reflection and communication within Song of Myself begins chronologically, and I think he did that intentionally. I also think that it's important to talk about how in Song of Myself, Walt humbles himself to the reader, and I believe he did that to allow for greater acceptance from his readership. He says towards the end of the poem, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." Walt, noting contradictions, reflects on all the interpretations of life, divinity, and afterlife that his readers may already have. Multitude, which he says, "I contain multitudes." Multitude is a term for a group of people who cannot be classed under any distinct category except for their shared fact of existence. Once again, go back to my grass analogy, right? See, it's all making sense. Walt found a unity of soul with nature, and the reason he found it was because it offered a promise of regeneration, a comfort of the soul carrying on in a cyclical and never-ending manner, possibly even in the form of different matter, like grass or plants. So I'd like to share a short passage from the Song of Myself, and I shared just a portion of this earlier, but I think this is a very, very beautiful portion, so I'm going to share this. This would be approximately part 6, but because I'm reading it from the first edition, it's not sectioned into parts. "A child said, 'What is the grass?' fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or, I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white. Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff, I give them the same, I receive them the same. And now, it seems to me, the beautiful uncut hair of graves. And then it skips a couple stanzas, and I'd like to share. What do you think has become of the young and old men? And what do you think has become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life, and does not wait at the end to arrest it, and ceased the moment life appeared. All goes onward and outward, and nothing collapses. And to die is different from what anyone supposed, and lucky. Because of the suggestion of regeneration and reincarnation through sprouts and life, that feels very hopeful. It should make death feel a little less icky and scary. Even Whitman talks about how we should feel lucky in death. But, in contrast to Whitman and his enlightening, beautiful poetry, there is also another famous writer, posthumously, Emily Dickinson, who contrasts that. She writes about death in a very different light, and she writes that all people molder, which is an old school word for decay or disintegrate, equally, and that death is dead, and that was recalling John Donne's holy sonnet, Death Be Not Proud, where he writes, death shall not die, death is imminent. Dickinson focuses grimly on the ultimate demise of death. Her nameless corpses are peevish, perturbed, and angry at death. She gives cantankerous cadavers a voice. Another theme in Dickinson's writing is her homesickness for mortality, wishing she dies for a resolute end. Whitman differed from her because he thought neither life nor death was home. Dickinson also seemed to have many questions and issues on the enlightenment and security of Orthodox faith and salvation. I'd like to share a popular poem that explores some of these concepts in a very brief way, and I'm sure you've probably heard the first line. This is from Emily Dickinson, it's poem 712. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And I think that's a really, really packed poem because she kind of, when she talks about her tippet being only tulle and her gown only gossamer, my interpretation is that that's talking about the religious religious material that is worn, the tippet, and she's saying that it's see-through, and she talks about a house coming out of the ground. I mean, it's not like it's some beaming cloud full in the skies. Sounds like it's hell. And also, again, she talks about how the carriage kindly stops for her, and that they take their time, and that life carries on, the sun sets them, and so she's just kind of making a stab at a lot of different beliefs. And I encourage you to read it and make a lot of things. So, why would Emily's view of death differ so much from Walt's? One theory, perhaps, is because of oppression. Emily Dickinson, who was a famous hermit, was a woman living in the same time as Whitman, and she was not afforded the same wandering and opportunity that Whitman was granted through his societal position of the times as a white man. Dickinson, a very dedicated writer, could not publish her work under her name during her lifetime. She could not enroll in continuing education. She was stunted in her goals. I think that is why she had such a grim outlook. She was not going to accomplish what she wanted to achieve. She died at 55, and she had a really terrible death, by the way. Both prolific writers, I do think that Whitman's poetry allows for deep reflection. I think it is as comforting as many religious beliefs surrounding mortality and the afterlife. It allows us, the reader, to have a moment to consider the connections all around us, the energies that make us uniquely ourselves, possibly even the energies of loved ones past. And I'd like to read this last portion of Song of Myself. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nevertheless, and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep in courage. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere waiting for you. I get goosebumps reading that. It's beautiful. It's beautiful talking about how when I'm gone, look for me all around you. If you don't find me right away, it's okay. I'm near. I'm near. You'll find me. So, a few more quick things before we end it. I would like to just ask, in the words of Walt himself, have you ever felt so proud to get to the meaning of a poem? We just extricated Song of Myself. I'd also like to share that in the first edition of Leaves of Grass, I think one of the most beautiful things about the edition is, like I said, it begins with I and ends with you. But also notably, the very last word, you, does not have a period. The other editions do, but the very first one, with proper punctuation throughout the whole poem, it doesn't end. And I think that's so beautiful. I think it leaves it open-ended. I think Walt even knew when he published it, I don't think it was just a career choice. I think he knew he had more exploring to do and that he wasn't cement in his concepts yet. So I think that's really, really beautiful that it doesn't end with a period. But on the 9th and final version of Leaves of Grass, as he prepared to die at the age of 72, Walt finally penned this opening to his final edition of Leaves of Grass. He wrote, L of G, at last complete. After 33 years of hackling at it, all times and moods of my life, fair weather and foul, all parts of the land, and peace and war, young and old. And he ended it with a period. So thank you. That's what I have today. And if you have any questions,